So, with Lincoln dead, the question remained, how do we put the country back together? So today we're going to focus on the conflict between Congress and the president for control over the Reconstruction process. Because, of course, Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, who was, of course, a Southerner, would have a very different vision for reintegrating the South into society than, of course, would the radical Republicans in Congress, who were much more still upset about the whole Civil War thing. So Andrew Johnson becomes president when Lincoln is assassinated. As we mentioned, he is a Southerner who was put on the ticket, and a former Democrat, I should say, who was put on the ticket in order to sort of balance out and convince the border states that Lincoln would not view them too harshly. So Johnson is going to basically try to carry on with Lincoln's Reconstruction plan, the sort of very lenient presidential Reconstruction with 10% of Southern officials taking the loyalty oath, and then the states get reconstructed. The one condition that they placed on Southern states is they would have to ratify the 13th Amendment, which formally got rid of slavery, and of course would then eliminate slavery in the areas that the Emancipation Proclamation did not eliminate slavery. And so the 13th Amendment was surprisingly controversial, especially in some of the more racist areas of the North and sort of in the West. And so Southern ratification was absolutely essential in order to get the 2/3 majority for ratification. So one condition of Southern Reconstruction was the 13th Amendment will get ratified 100%. And you could sort of see the areas that were, in general, more pro-Southern would be much more hesitant about the whole, freeing of slaves thing. Because, as we mentioned before, they were worried about competition from freed slaves coming in and competing with their, farmers. For the loyalty oaths, this is the part that Johnson really, really liked. The Southern officials had to come in and give these loyalty oaths, and Johnson would spend large portions of his day taking the loyalty oaths in person. He grew up from a small farming family, sort of in Tennessee, and so he always resented the slave-owning aristocracy. And so to have these really powerful and rich men come in and give loyalty oaths to him personally, Johnson found that very gratifying. And so he spent a lot of his time doing this. And so under presidential Reconstruction, states started to be reconstructed and come back into the Union. And they started electing their new legislative coalition, their new legislative governments. And so as the Southern delegates started to return, the Northerners started to sense a pattern, and that's that in general, the same people who had walked out in '61 to start the Civil War were returning. The Southern delegations were overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly plantation owner, and overwhelmingly segregationist. Probably the most egregious example of this is the election of Alex Stevens of Georgia to the U.S. Senate. So the vice president of the Confederacy was coming back to the Senate. And at this point, the Congressional Republicans, the radical Republicans, said this is not going to stand, because clearly the South hasn't learned anything and very little has changed. And so we started to see agitation amongst the radical Republicans that we needed to do something different vis-a-vis Reconstruction. The other thing that really convinced radical Republicans that the South hadn't learned anything was the passage of what were called black codes. Black codes were very restrictive laws limiting the freedom and rights of African Americans, and in a lot of cases they were simply the slave codes that the Southern states had previously, except with the word slave crossed out and replaced with the word person of color. And so, for example, newly freed person of color could not, were banned from learning to read and write, could not leave their plantation without a written pass from a white person, and, could not gather in groups. And it was creating a basically slavery in all but name. And so with the South planning to basically keep everyone enslaved, the North was like, this will not stand, and we're going to change. We're going to force the South to legitimately change their society. And so Johnson started to become the face of this, started to become the face of the South not changing and not learning anything. And so he became the target for congressional forces who argued that his Reconstruction was basically re-enslaving African Americans and us learning nothing from the Civil War. So, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which provided equal protection under the law for everybody. So this is going to totally invalidate all those slave codes. It's going to mean that everyone has equal access to education. It's going to provide theoretically voting rights for African Americans. And it's basically the first attempt to mandate equality. And of course, this is going to be heavily resented by Southerners because, this might mean that African Americans are equal to them and might have the power to vote, which would be very powerful, especially in the Southern states where African Americans outnumbered the white population. And so, Johnson, of course, vetoes the Civil Rights Act, arguing that it's racist against white people by trying to make black people equal to them, and Congress then overrides his veto with a 2/3 majority. Congress also passes the Freedmen's Bureau to try to provide rights and support and economic aid for newly freed African Americans, and Johnson vetoes that as well, and they pass it over his veto. So here he is trying to lead these two acts into the veto woods, and Congress is going to force it through over his head. So with the passage of these two acts over Johnson's veto, we enter a phase called radical Reconstruction, or Congressional Reconstruction, where Reconstruction is now being led by the radical Republican leaders in Congress as opposed to the president. Of course, all of this, the new Reconstruction Act and everything else, is going to be vetoed by Johnson, but Congress and the remnants of Lincoln's cabinet are simply going to force it through them. So here's the congressional canon forcing the South and Congress to capitulate because, of course, radical Republicans still hold the vast majority of the congressional seats, and so Johnson's veto becomes somewhat meaningless. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 completely changes the terms of Reconstruction. So out is the whole loyalty oath thing, and the states are now non-reconstructed again. It's going to divide the South up into 5 military districts, and it's going to force all of these states to ratify a new amendment, the 14th Amendment, which we'll talk about here momentarily, which provides congressional basis for the Civil Rights Act, so full equality under the law. All of these southern states, until they are reconstructed, are then kept under military rule. They are divided up into, as we said, 5 military districts, shown here, each under the command of a Union general who will oversee the reconstruction process in these states until they are reconstructed to Congress's satisfaction. With the goal, of course, being to make them provide equal rights to everyone and to prevent white Southerners from venting their anger on the newly freed African American population. And so we see here a Union general trying to keep white Southerners and newly freed African Americans from reopening the whole conflict over civil rights and African American status. So the 14th Amendment is then ratified. This absolutely requires southern states because a lot of northern states were very sort of skeptical of this. But the 14th Amendment provides equal protection under the law and establishes birthright citizenship, that anyone born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. And so this is changing the Constitution to invalidate the Dred Scott decision, which, as we mentioned, is the Supreme Court case that denied African American citizenship. And so in order to overturn that Supreme Court case, we then create this new amendment to make sure that, yes, it is constitutional for African Americans to be citizens. Johnson, of course, does his best to stop all of this, and so Congress puts together an impeachment trap for President Johnson to sort of get him out of the way. They passed something called the Tenure of Office Act, which significantly decreases presidential power by preventing him from removing members of his cabinet to basically just keep Lincoln's cabinet in place. So the president can be sort of shunted off to the side, everyone's going to ignore him, and the cabinet's going to basically go about their business. Johnson, of course, thought the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional because it probably was. It decreased the president's constitutionally given powers. And so President Johnson fired his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and Congress then brought articles of impeachment against President Johnson. This is, of course, the first impeachment trial in American history. And so Johnson was put on trial, and he was tried on 11 different charges. And in the end, Congress ended up acquitting President Johnson, but the agreement was that once he was acquitted, he would not interfere with politics again, and he would not run for re-election, which wasn't a big sacrifice for him because no one would vote for him anyway. And so, in the election of 1868, radical Republicans nominate General Ulysses Grant for president. Grant was somewhat interested in politics, but he didn't really have a major political platform. He was mostly running on his war record. And so Grant is going to face off against a Democrat that you don't really need to know, because, quite frankly, Republicans are going to dominate national politics in the years following the Civil War. This is because Republicans traditionally used a technique called waving the bloody shirt, basically reminding everyone that Democrats were responsible for the secession and for the Civil War and painting them as disloyal. And this was a good way to mobilize the Republican base and marginalize Democrats at a national level. So here we see, I think this is Richard Sherman waving the bloody shirt, demonstrating clearly these Southerners are, responsible for all these deaths, and therefore clearly you should vote Republican. The other thing that greatly benefited the Grant administration was the passage of the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed voting rights to African Americans. And so we're going to start seeing a lot of southern states also voting Republican because African Americans are constitutionally given the right to vote. And a lot of white Southerners, in protest of African Americans' newly gotten rights, would then, of course, not vote for president. And so we see a lot of former Confederate states going Republican in at least a few years after the Civil War. So you can see the popular vote is still somewhat close because, of course, tribal political identity is still an important part of American society. But in the electoral vote, it's 100% not close. Grant wins in a landslide, and Richard Seymour of New York is defeated. Of course, for African Americans, this is a watershed moment. This is the famous cartoon, The First Vote, depicting a series of different African Americans of different socioeconomic status showing up to vote, including, as you can see in the background, a former Union soldier. So demonstrating that the political rights that African Americans fought for had now been gained at long last. One of the biggest opponents to the 15th Amendment, unfortunately, were women, because they had fought long and hard for the rights of African Americans, and then when it came time to get constitutional rights to more people to vote, radical Republicans decided that all men would be able to vote with the 15th Amendment, but women would continue to be excluded. And so this led to new suffrage groups being formed by women, and a lot of really racist arguments used by female suffragettes, basically that if inferior African Americans can vote, why are we not giving the vote to American women? And so you get some very radical suffragette groups, which are going to become increasingly powerful, especially next semester.